I'd like to welcome you to hear our authors, Stephen and Paul Kendrick. Their book, Sarah's Long Walk, The Free Blacks of America and How Their Struggle for Equality Changed America, was published in 2005 by the Beacon Press. Stephen is senior minister at the First Church in Boston. He's the author of Holy Clues, The Gospel According to Sherlock Holmes, and a novel, Night Watch, a long-lost adventure in which Sherlock Holmes meets Father Brown. He is also co-author of his co-author, Paul. Paul is currently pursuing a master's in public administration from George Washington University in Washington, D.C., where he got his bachelor's degree in 2005 after taking a semester off to really work on this project with his father. It took, of course, longer than one semester, and it was really inspiring to see Paul day after day going through our newspaper, The Liberator, from issue number 1 in 1831 to the last in December 29th, 1865.
Yeah, we repealed the child labor laws.
Yeah. And all of us in Reference and Special Collections really enjoyed being there as the discoveries were made. And we're so pleased to be here to hear about the results and to announce that they have another project in the works, a book about Frederick Douglass and Abraham Lincoln during the Civil War, and they've got a book contract with Walker. So, please welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for coming out this morning. I really can't stress enough how special this is to be here. This book was really born here. The research we did day after day. I would come in a football jersey and baggy jeans. I really stood out among the researchers at the Athenaeum, but they never judged me. And especially Stephen Nonak, Lisa Starzyk, Philip Ross, and of course, Mary, were just so helpful through this whole process. It was just incredible. We owe them such a debt of gratitude, which we're actually paying back in library fines to this day. But they were really incredible. So, yeah, I guess you guys get a lot of writers here at the Athenaeum. Probably not a lot of father and son combinations. This is my son, Stephen. Yeah, he aged a lot.
He really ages you.
Yeah. But so I guess it's kind of a unique, a unique talk in that way. This is actually true. There was a newspaper in Washington D.C. that did an article about this book, and the headline was, and I from my heart, this is honestly true. The headline was "Father and Son Write Book and Still Talk."
Which true.
He won't be talking today. It's just me. But it was an incredible experience to be here in I think the most beautiful place in America, and get to come in day after day and read these liberators and research this book. So to be back here with all of you today is it's really special.
Thank you. We're often asked, how did we get the idea to write this book? And in fact, we were together in, of all places, Memphis, Tennessee. We were attending our denomination's General Assembly in Nashville, and Paul and I escaped for a day. We rented a car, and I said, "Paul, I really think you need to go to Graceland." He said, "No, Dad, we're not going to Graceland. We are going to go to Memphis. We're going to walk along Beale Street. We're going to really savor where the Stax records are born, and we are also going to go to the brand new, just opened National Civil Rights Museum, which is, to my amazement, the old Lorraine Motel, where Martin Luther King Jr. was killed." And it was family day, and we were the only whites there that day. And we walked through, and at the beginning of the exhibition area, there's a huge timeline of American history. And we noted, to our pleasure and astonishment, because I read a lot of history, and I'd never noted this, it was a little piece of the timeline for 1849, how Boston was the first major city in America to desegregate its schools. And it talked about a little girl named Sarah Roberts, 5 years old, who had to walk past 5 white schools to get to the Smith School. And how her father, a printer, had sued not only the school committee of Boston, but had actually taken the case all the way up to the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court before Judge Lemuel Shaw, who we'll talk about later. And how this case had created two realities. One was, through Shaw's judgment, the creation of something called, and I know you've heard of it, separate but equal. One of the great illusions of all time. A legal fiction, and certainly a social one. But also, that this case galvanized the free black community that we're going to be talking about today to really forge a campaign, an amazing campaign, that ended up with, in 1855, the desegregation of the Boston schools. Now, anyone who lived in Boston in the 1960s and 70s and who is alive and aware now know that we live in a time of resegregation. Paul and I are realistic, and we're well aware that this book is not simply a plea to the past, a relic of moral grandeur. It is a very contemporary book, although it is about the past. It's about people, ordinary people, who had the genius of boldness and how they came together as a community with very little political capital, and they did amazing things. Paul and I, as we researched this book, realized it was more than just the story of the Roberts family. And I should add that many members of the Roberts family still live here in Boston. They certainly are looking for the burial place of Sarah. They are really hoping in time to write their family's history. And we want to support that in any way that we can. And we realized that as the scope of the book broadened, it became not just Boston local history, a legal case that was born on Beacon Hill, but rather a truly national story. And I would submit to you a national victory, and we'll talk more about that later. When we later moved to Boston and lived on Beacon Hill, it became very real to us. It became like following a detective story. Very little of the records of the free black community were preserved, other than those, really, of Frederick Douglass, who lived, of course, in New Bedford and then Lynn, and then later on into Rochester, New York. But we discovered amazing men and women who forged interesting alliances with white abolitionists. But this is a story of more than abolition. It is truly a story of the civil rights movement being born 100 years before the Montgomery bus boycott. And indeed, a direct legal line into 1954's Brown versus the Board of Education. Thurgood Marshall's legal team had to not only overturn separate but equal, which was born in this case, but the eventual Brown versus Board of Education as a legal judgment was going to draw upon the legal arguments of two men, one white, one black, who stood together in 1849 right on Court Street, an old building that's gone. But they spoke before the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court and made arguments that we submit changed American history, and that Earl Warren and the Thurgood Marshall both drew upon. In the Brown versus Board decision, the only legal reference is to the Roberts case. We'll talk more about that history of how it developed, but I want to emphasize this is truly a national story, but we here in Boston today, here as we stand in the Boston Athenaeum, can, I think, take some personal pleasure and curiosity in following the trail of this story and these often lost historical figures. One of the things we wanted to talk about is this is a story of more than just desegregation of schools. That was the heart of it. That was the linchpin of it. That was the motivating energy of it. Were white and black children to be together as they learned? Could society knit together its fragmented and disparate parts, somehow through the way that our children learn together? This is a live question today. It's not been solved. It's one of the things that we'll talk about as we proceed. But they did much more than this. They desegregated transportation. An amazing story of how they took the railway cars and through boycotts effectively desegregated the railway cars and theaters and interracial marriage. You know, we seem in Massachusetts to be fighting another battle about the nature of marriage. Let us not forget that this battle was fought before and won. And through a monument to Crispus Attucks, the free black community galvanized the nation into helping create the first regiment of black soldiers who fought for the very end of slavery itself. So that's the overview of the story. But it begins, as I've intimated, with a little girl and her father. We write in our book, when Sarah turned 4, in April 1847, her father Benjamin applied to the primary school committee for Sarah's admission to the school closest to their house. They lived not on Beacon Hill, near the Smith School, but closer to the docks on the north end, where cold winds blew in from the harbor and swirled down the narrow streets. To get to the Smith School from their residence in Andover Street, they would first take a right into Causeway, a left onto Prospect, cross into Stanford, which fed into Cambridge at the foot of Beacon Hill. And from there, it was a steep walk up Beacon Hill along Belknap Street, which is, of course, now Joy Street. Despite the exertion this walk demanded, the 4-year-old's ticket of admission to her nearest school was declined. And when her parents petitioned the district committee, they quickly rejected their plea. Roberts then took his grievance to the general school committee, complained that making Sarah travel this extra distance was unfair, and for the third time, his efforts were rebuked. And frustrated by his inability to penetrate an apparently immovable bureaucracy, oh, nothing's changed, has it? Roberts stubbornly chose to defy the mandate of the school board. He resolved to take Sarah to the closest white school and enroll her directly, which he did. And he tried this at the Phillips School, but he was turned away by Principal Andrew Cotton because Sarah did not have the required ticket of admission. And next he tried the Otis School, where surprisingly, Sarah was admitted. It's unclear how Benjamin Roberts pulled this off, but Sarah sat there for some months. Because, we presume, he found a sympathetic principal, willing to ignore the rules. Or perhaps he'd been lucky enough to find a school unaware of the rule of segregation in Boston, but we believe that is highly unlikely. Nevertheless, little Sarah was doing something that no black child had done in almost a half century in Boston, which was to sit among white pupils. But this was not to last. The school committee learned and realized that the 4-year-old Sarah had to be removed. And she was, one day, by a police officer. The emotional damage, you can only imagine. A 4-year-old being forcibly taken from her classroom by a policeman. And no matter what other legal references we make today, or larger points we wish to make about society, don't lose the fact that the emotional heart of this book is in that moment and in that day. Now, that might have settled the issue for most people, but Benjamin Roberts was a very stubborn man, this printer, who believed that somehow, some way, he might be able to shake and change the society in which he lived. He had determination, and so he went and knocked on the door of a 27-year-old black lawyer named Robert Morris.
Paul? So who was Robert Morris? Morris is kind of the hero of the story in a lot of ways. His grandfather was a slave in Salem, Massachusetts, who had come from Africa. His father was a servant, also in Salem. And he was really headed for the same fate. His father died when he was young, and he was working as a servant in a prominent household in Salem. When one Thanksgiving, he was 13 years old, and the guests of this family for Thanksgiving was a family named the Lorings. Now, the man in that family was Ellis Gray Loring, who was an abolitionist lawyer here in Boston, a white abolitionist lawyer. And he noticed that this young 13-year-old who was serving everybody just had a real natural intelligence, a real natural spark about him. And he needed some help at his house in Boston, so he asked Robert Morris if he could come to live with the Lorings in Boston. And Morris's mother accepted this, so off Morris goes at age 13 to a new life in Boston, Massachusetts. But it was really fortuitous because he is coming in to a household of activism and where of people who are concerned about these abolitionist issues. And for a number of years he works for Loring, and Loring had a white legal apprentice at the time, a few years on from when Morris has come to Boston. And Loring starts noticing that this young white legal apprentice is kind of lazy and is not actually doing the work he's supposed to be there doing. And it's Morris, the young servant, who's actually been writing briefs and been helping with a lot of the legal tasks this young apprentice was asked to do. And again, so he's amazed by the intelligence of this young man, and he asks Morris if he wants to be trained to be a lawyer. Now keep in mind, never in American history has a case ever been won by a black man. But Loring decides, he asks him if he wants to be a lawyer. Morris says yes. He decides he's going to train this young man to become a lawyer. And he does that. And Morris trains for a number of years. And finally he's on the verge of his first case. It was the nature of the case was pretty minor, a debt that hadn't been paid. But so he goes to see the white attorney the day before the trial, and the attorney is shocked. He's going against a black lawyer. There was no precedent for this at all. We're talking 1840s America. And he doesn't even offer Morris a seat in his office. And he says, are you going to try this case? And Morris says, yes. And he says, well, I will give you the devil. And but the next day, Morris walks into that courtroom, which is filled to the brink with the black community of Boston, out to see this young legal prodigy. And Morris wins the case. And it's a huge deal for this black community. So, but let me kind of pause for a second and kind of reflect upon this society that he's coming into, this free black community of Boston. Now keep in mind, we're talking, I think a lot of people in the American history they have in school and stuff don't really get the idea of that there were free blacks in America before the Civil War, because they were a very small minority. It's about 1 in 10 African Americans in America would have been free. And Frederick Douglass once said, well, in the South, you're slave to an individual. In the North, you're a slave to the community. And what did he mean by that? He meant there were just very few economic opportunities. This is a poor, poor community. And there were no civil rights. They were just discriminated against. I mean, it's very hard to understate how severe the racism was at this time. And so the free black community of Boston was mainly centered around the back side of Beacon Hill, the side that faces Cambridge Street. And we've often thought it's kind of a microcosm for America, black and white, so close as they were on Beacon Hill, and yet very separated by Phillips Street that runs across the top of Beacon Hill. But here you have this free black community living here. But Boston's community was very unique in the audacious nature of their activism. And Morris comes into this. And why do I say that? Because you can understand how abolitionism was a huge issue here in Boston, but the community that Morris comes into when he moves to Boston from Salem isn't just concerned about abolitionism. They're concerned about their civil rights. And that's kind of a theme we'll come back to again and again, how bold that really is. And so the community that as Morris is becoming a young lawyer, and he won that case at age 23. I think that is worth really thinking about how talented this young man was. This community first has kind of two principal struggles. That there was an old law in the books from the time when Massachusetts did have legalized slavery against interracial marriage, and they launch a struggle against that. They launch a struggle also against segregation in transportation on the railway lines. And the tactics they're using in these two struggles really make you think more about the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s in terms of transportation. And Morris is participating in these things with a young Frederick Douglass, who was, as my dad mentioned, living in New Bedford. They do sit-ins. They sit on these trains, and they are forcibly taken out. Once Douglass, as a young man, is taken out, literally, he was so strong, he held onto the chair. He's picked up, he's holding the chair, thrown off the train, holding the chair. That's something we think of, in the 1950s and 60s. They're doing that. And also, very savvy economic boycotts. In The Liberator, which oftentimes served as kind of the publication for the free black community, that's how we were able to learn a lot of the kind of the intricacies of this community was by reading The Liberator. They publish which railway lines are segregating and which are not. And so they're boycotting. They're boycotting transportation based on segregation. Very audacious. They win both of those struggles in the early 1840s. That kind of sets the stage for this community turning their attention towards segregated schools. Now, it was not a universally held opinion in the black community of Beacon Hill that we want integrated schools. For many, the Smith School was a great community institution, and they saw no reason to send their children into Boston schools where the racism was just unimaginable. You really want to send your child into a school where, heaven knows what they're going to have to deal with. The Smith School was a great community institution. So when people first start talking about a struggle for integration, this is very controversial on the Hill. But they gained more support because there was a very cruel white teacher at the time who would do things like just whip these students. And, some of these students literally were families that were fugitives from slavery. So the idea to be here in the North suffering from those sorts of things really turned a lot of people against the school. And the Smith School was very dilapidated, underfunded. I was looking through the Boston School Committee old records and found that, the libraries at some of the other schools were worth, $100, $200, and they actually had in their records estimated the Smith School library worth $3. So people start asking these questions about why Benjamin Roberts, this free black printer, asked why is his daughter having to walk past 5 white schools on the way to her segregated school. And so they initiate, the Roberts case comes in the context of a boycott that is initiated against this school. A boycott where they are saying, do not send your children to the school. We are going to make it, again, using economic means as a way of protest, we are going to make it economically unfeasible for Boston to keep open this segregated school because only a few kids are going to be going there. So they set up schools in people's living rooms on Beacon Hill where the children are going to come there and learn instead of having to go to this segregated school. And on the first day of school in 1849, the children are going in the morning, but the integrationists, Robert Morris and Benjamin Roberts and William Nell, some of the other folks that you learn more about in the book, stand outside the school with their arms clenched together, not letting children go into the school. And the Boston police actually had to come and just get the people out of the way because they would literally not let children go into the school. And at night, they're having a meeting at the African Meeting House next door, the integrationists are. And here's how controversial integration was. The people who are in favor of keeping the school open, they're having their meeting, and all of a sudden rocks start coming through the windows. Glass is shattering. People are hiding under the pews. The people who wanted to keep the school open are throwing these things. It had come to the point of violence. That's how controversial the idea of integration was for this community. So that's the context of Benjamin Roberts turning to Robert Morris, who again is the talk of the community, this young black lawyer. He's actually a pretty short man, but they said just being around him is like it's like he grew in front of you because he was so animated, because he was so passionate, because he was so intelligent. He turns to Robert Morris and says, well, let's try to do this through the legal system. Now, of course, they didn't have much legal ground to stand on. We didn't have an equal protection 14th Amendment in the late 1840s. But Robert Morris takes this case and goes to the Court of Common Pleas, and he does not argue about that the Smith School is dilapidated and anything like that. He just argues on the principle of equality, and that's very important because when Charles Sumner, the famous white attorney, comes into this case, a lot of the few historians that have written about this case just write about Charles Sumner. But this was Robert Morris's case first. And one of the things I'm most proud of with this book is that we discovered that he spoke at the appeals hearing, which no one had ever noted before. So this was Robert Morris's case first. And he framed these arguments, he framed them about equality, but he loses that first hearing at the Court of Common Pleas. But he decides he's going to appeal the case. But he does want, he's in his mid-20s. He wants someone with a little more experience, with a bigger name in Boston, to give it a little more weight and a little more publicity, and he turns to a man named Charles Sumner.
And Charles Sumner was also a young lawyer, 2 years away from being elected to the Senate, where he would have a long career and as a firebrand. At the time, tunnels weren't named after him. He was still fairly unknown. And a fascinating person who has not been well treated in American history. A rehabilitation of Charles Sumner is well in order and is underway. And I hope that our book is part of that. Charles Sumner, as far as we know, Robert Morris and Charles Sumner formed the first interracial legal team to ever argue a case in American history. And they went before Judge Lemuel Shaw. How many people here have heard of Judge Shaw? He was the father-in-law of Herman Melville and a great legal genius, certainly presided over antebellum America. Over 3,000 cases that he presided over, he was only overturned 3 times. He was an amazing legal genius. But as we discovered, he also created a legal virus that took a long time to begin to move out of American life. Judge Shaw lived right around the corner from the Smith School. All these characters lived in about a 10 by 20 block area. It's amazing how small Boston really ultimately is. And so they went before Judge Shaw, who is often described by some historians as a great warty toad bestriding the bench. And they knew that they had a very tough argument to make. But the pre-black community was very excited, and so were their abolitionist allies. They felt that they had a strong case, although, as Paul correctly notes, they did not have the 14th Amendment, which was only passed at the conclusion of the Civil War. So what were they going to base their argument upon? Well, first of all, it's extraordinarily important to note, and we're just going to spend a little bit of time on this, because it's probably a piece of American history you haven't heard and is extraordinarily important. So when Morris and Sumner make their argument, they're making it also in the same building, the same month, as the great George Parkman murder case. And in fact, the same judges are overseeing it. And in fact, Sumner had actually turned down the case. As he stood before Judge Shaw, he began by making a very quick and important legal point. Can any discrimination of color or race be made under the Constitution and laws of Massachusetts among the children entitled to the benefits of our common schools? That was his opening question. It was the question of the day, and we would submit a very powerful opening salvo in American history itself. And we went to the Boston Social Law Library, where there are 52 large volumes, where Judge Shaw actually sat down and made his notes as the lawyers in front of him made their case, their argument. And to actually open this up and read the material from this case was actually very moving to us. And we were able to examine both the argument that Sumner and Morris are making, which was later, immediately after the case, printed by none other than Benjamin Roberts, and also the seeds of the thinking of Judge Shaw as he sits upon the bench and begins to formulate what his decision will be, which will be extraordinarily important for American life. As Sumner compared the great wealthy city of Boston with this 5-year-old child, this girl. We don't know whether Sarah was in the courtroom that December day or not, but we suspect that she probably was. He's described her this 5-year-old girl of humble parents, still within the period of natural infancy. And he said this young girl is, quote, strong from her very weakness. This little child asked at your hands her personal rights, and by doing so, asked for the rights of black children across the state. And he talked about what he called the North's peculiar institution, contrasting it to slavery. And he bases the entire legal argument on the Constitution of Massachusetts, written by John Adams. Thank God for John Adams, which states that all without distinction of color or race are equal before the law. It is upon this basis that the entire argument must move forward. And as if he could really see the incredible gears, legal gears, moving in Judge Shaw's mind, Sumner and Morris are very careful, as Paul has noted, not to argue the case upon the fact that the Smith School was not as good a school, not as well outfitted, that the teachers were not paid equally. They did not make the argument on that basis. They made it solely upon equality, because they didn't want to fall into the trap which Judge Shaw was going to snap later on of the argument of separate but equal. And so they wanted to stay away from that deep Pandora's box. And in words that anticipate the Brown versus Board of Education decision 106 years later, Sumner asserted that segregation gave any black child what he called a peculiar brand. And you can imagine the metaphor, the astonishing metaphor that he's making here. A clear and lasting stigma of what he called, they didn't have the word racism back then, it was caste, using the imagery from the Hindu tradition of caste, that, quote, deprives them of those healthful, animating influences. It widens their separation from the rest of the community and postpones the great day of reconciliation, which is sure to come. And in a very early version of the logic of affirmative action, Sumner made a radical leap that day. He said, without diversity, yes, it is true that black children would suffer. He made an equally and more powerfully audacious argument. He added this, and in the book we place this in italics, that the whole system of public schools suffers also. And then he declared the whites themselves are injured by this separation, and who can doubt this? Well, of course, the entire society doubted it. The entire legal system doubted it. But once said, particularly in this context, words cannot be unsaid. They become facts within themselves. He said words that his contemporaries considered to be the most noble and powerful words that he ever spoke. The school is the little world in which the child is trained for the larger world of life. It must therefore cherish and develop the virtues and the sympathies which are employed in the larger world. And since, according to our institutions, all classes meet without distinction of color in the performance of civil duties, so should they all meet without distinction of color in the school, beginning there those relations of equality which our Constitution and laws promise to all. He said, near the conclusion of his argument, that prejudice is the child of ignorance. By the next March, 1850, Judge Shaw's decision was handed down. Despite everyone's optimism, Judge Shaw turned down the right of Sarah Roberts. The case was lost. And further, something was born called separate but equal, which would be later, in the 1890s, encoded into Supreme Court law through the great case of Plessy versus Ferguson, which made separate but equal not a doctrine about the school system in Boston, but every facet of American life, from water coolers to libraries to movie houses, every aspect of American life. It's what Thurgood Marshall had to overturn from this little case of the little Sarah Roberts. Well, it was a long legal journey to the point where Thurgood Marshall's legal team, in a 10-year battle, had finally reached the Supreme Court. Well, we tell that story in the book, but we know that we need to, at this point, maybe tell you a little bit of what happens to the people who are at the key and heart of this story, and then a little bit about what is happening to us, because this is not just history. This is lived reality among us today. Paul?
But it is important to note that, we found in going through some NAACP papers, NAACP Legal Defense Fund, that it was these lawyers, Thurgood Marshall, Jack Greenberg, Robert Carter, again, another interracial legal duo, that actually is trio, but a team, how they go back to Sumner and Morris's arguments. And so the things that Sumner and Morris laid out, they're never quite improved upon over 100 years. And so not only does separate but equal come out of this, but equality before the law is something that they say, and that will be an animating principle in the struggle to desegregate the entire country. But what happened on the Hill after that? Well, it was quite a tumultuous 5 years after they lose this case, because the next year, something called the Fugitive Slave Law is passed. And what this means is that pretty much any black person can be taken off the street and without virtually any legal recourse can be sent into slavery in the South. Imagine
Federal marshals.
Imagine the fear this gives a community, many of whom were fugitives, but some who were not. But yet a lot of people head towards Canada, and people's energies turn towards fighting this. But what is so amazing about the book is that they never lost sight of the school issue. So over the next 5 years, while they are working on the fugitive slave law issue, they're still, Benjamin Roberts and Robert Morris and others are still focused on opening up the schools in Boston. So they petition over and over. Now they turn towards the state legislature. They petition them. They write editorials. They speak all over the state. They keep people focused on this issue. Robert Morris brings forth another case that we talk about more in the book. And even Robert Morris, at the time, there was a man named, anyone heard of Shadrach Minkins? He was a fugitive slave in Boston who was arrested by federal marshals. And he was in the court waiting for the quick, procedural hearing before he's sent back to the South. And Robert Morris, with a group of black men from Beacon Hill, run into the courtroom, take this man out, and run to Black Beacon Hill and get him on his way to Canada. And Robert Morris goes on trial for his life. He's on trial for treason, which is punishable by death. I mean, you can't take somebody out of a federal courtroom. You can't do that. And so all that's happening in these 5 years, and yet Morris is still focused on the school issue. And so we write more about that case in the book. But the point being, in 1855, after a lot of lobbying towards the legislature, we talk about what happens, how the Know-Nothings come into power, and while they were a very nativist party, there were also people within that Know-Nothing coalition who were reformers. And they find a young white legislator named Charles Slack who actually really, really likes their cause. And he is able to kind of orchestrate, in 1855, the desegregation of Massachusetts schools. So they have won. For the first time in American history, there's a major city, Boston, who will have desegregated schools. And it worked for the first few years. On the day that they integrated the schools, September 3rd, 1855, there's no violence. There's nobody throwing rocks. Kids go into their nearest schools, and it works. Sarah, we wanted to find out kind of what happened to her. That was a struggle. She's in a lot of ways lost to history. We found some things out about her life. She married a sailor who had fought in the Civil War, and she lived in New Haven, Connecticut near the end of her life. She never got to experience free schools in Boston because her father did another form of protest. He moved them out of Boston, and so she went to school in Cambridge. But what we did find out about the family is that the Roberts family, like you said earlier, is still here in Boston. And when we did a talk early on when the book came out, a lot of members of the family came to the talk. And it was probably the most special moment to me of this whole process, because someone stood up and said, we knew the story, but until we read this book, we didn't quite feel the emotion of it. And that means so much to us. And that was pretty profound. But it's interesting that the woman who stood up and said that, who is Sarah Roberts' descendant, what's her job today? Works in public schools in Boston. So the Roberts family is still there. Morris has a distinguished career as a lawyer, runs for mayor of Chelsea at one point. We talk a lot about what happens to him and his friendship with people in the Irish community of Boston, and that's a whole interesting story. But what happens to this community in general is, like I said, desegregated schools worked at first, but it's residential segregation over the decades that takes its toll, and that, when we talk about, well, they won and Boston schools are integrated, a lot of audiences look at us like, well, we lived here in the 1970s, what are you talking about, But that was the toll of de facto segregation and residential segregation, and so that's why these battles have to be fought again. And why we wrote this book in a lot of ways for activists, because to say, a lot of people have kind of given up on integrated schools in America. You don't hear politicians talking about solutions to this that much anymore. And people sometimes feel helpless. But you have to say, if they could fight for integrated schools and win at a time when there was the fugitive slave law, where 9 in 10 African Americans were in slavery, where people believed in a scientific racism, why can't we do this today? And I think this book really calls us to carry on that struggle in a lot of ways. So I'll let you kind of wrap this up and talk about that theme.
Because we want to make sure that you have time for questions, and we want to wrap up before 1. Well, the problems that were faced by the free black community and their white abolitionist allies, they have not been solved today, and we know that. Yes, American schools are still obstinately black and white, but it's crucial to realize that racism, as powerful as it is a social construct, and therefore it changes. It's not an unchanging current. It is not frozen into stasis. It can still warp and ruin lives, but it's also true that being a social concept, it can change, undergo subtle shifts and alterations before our very eyes. This community hoped we can do no better, and we have no right to do less. In the end, the story of Sarah's long walk, we believe, is more a promising indicator of a future that we can work for together than to appeal to the past. It is an unabashed evocation of certain core American values. What the citizens of Beacon Hill achieved before the Civil War, I believe, is a remarkable American story, as great as any victory on the battlefield or victory in a ballot box. And it's also important to remember, even in the midst of very tough times, that there still are promising things happening, and promising things happening in the Boston school system itself. In 2002, a group of Roxbury fourth graders from Emerson Elementary School, along with the Boston Cantata Singers, worked with composers Donald Sir and T.J. Anderson, and they put together a choral piece that was performed at the African Meeting House and as well at Boston Symphony Hall. They wrote a song with the children's lyrics. Sarah Roberts, born black and smart, every school she went to, she felt lonely. 1855, there was a new law, and a fair one too. Sarah Roberts, born black and smart. And for those children who wrote these lyrics, there is no doubt who is at the very center of this story. It is a little girl not much older than themselves. Sarah Roberts, proud to be an American. Her father fought for her rights. 2 lawyers, one black, one white, fought and won against unfairness. They didn't give up. They didn't give up. So we thank you very much for your attention and time. Any questions, please? Yes.
Benjamin Roberts' ancestor, who was his father Robert Roberts?
Yes.
Yes, that's a really interesting point.
What do you know about
Yeah, Benjamin Roberts, Sarah Roberts' father. She asked about Benjamin Roberts' ancestors and who, kind of a larger picture of who this family was. He came from a remarkable family. His father, Robert Roberts, was a house servant for Christopher Gore, who was the president of Harvard and a distinguished man in Massachusetts history. But he was not just any servant. He wrote a book about the house servants directory. Titles were back then, they went on and on. So, but the first kind of guide to kind of etiquette and
books written in American history
by a black person, yeah. And a very interesting guide to how to, handle a household perfectly. And so there was already a kind of a literary tradition in the family. So for Benjamin Roberts, it's interesting that his name was Benjamin Franklin Roberts, and he was also a printer. For him to carry on this legacy made a lot of sense. And Sarah's mother, her family was also a family of activists. And Sarah Roberts' mother, as a child, did kind of sit-ins. Her father made her go to white churches, and they would be thrown out of white churches, but they wanted to expose the hypocrisy of segregation in religion. And Sarah Roberts' Sarah's uncle, Hosea Easton, wrote a great book about racism in America, and he wrote that in the 1830s. So Sarah Roberts was born into a remarkable tradition of activism and of bravery and of courage, and I think that was very important for Benjamin. It's no wonder Benjamin was the guy who said, let's have a case where we challenge segregation in Boston.
Although we don't have a picture of Benjamin or Sarah, and we don't even know where Sarah's buried today. But in the last, I don't know whether the person's here today who called me and spoke to me, but they might be coming from the Gore place. Only in the last couple of years have we discovered the grave of Robert Roberts. So, hopefully he'll give us the answer. Thank you.
It's a cemetery in Everett, I think it's called Woodlawn.
Oh.
It's in Everett, and the gravestone is flat, and I think in pieces. And one of the things that I would like to have done in connection with the 200th anniversary of Gore Place is to have it glazed and set properly, appropriate ceremony. And that's it. I will make one slight correction, that is that Robert Roberts was Christopher Gore's father, and he ran that whole house. And I think they had something like 14 servants, and I don't know how many people around, because at that time it was 400 acres. If you haven't been to Gore Place, it's an incredible building. 50 rooms, and it now sits on 40 acres of gardens and sand and all that.
Yeah.
And the people at the Gore place are very helpful in our research and are working with the Roberts family to continue this research.
But I should emphasize one more time that, the Roberts family history, and it's certainly a lot of it's in this book, but we were very privileged that they would share that with us, and ultimately family history is really theirs to tell. And the protagonist of our story is Robert Morris. Sarah's obviously a huge part of it, but it's Morris who kind of drives our narrative.
And there are no living relatives of Robert Morris that we know of.
Other questions?
Other questions? Yeah.
How long was Sarah's walk?
It's actually a part of the legal documents themselves.
Yeah.
They actually measured it with rods, and I don't have that exact figure.
Yeah, I forget the exact figure, but you can think of it pretty much like from walking from the Fleet Center. Well, now what did they change the name to? Bank Garden. Yeah. You can think of it from watching the Celtics lose to walking up to kind of midway up Beacon Hill. So in actuality, it was not that. I mean, for a 5-year-old, that actually is a long walk. You have the winds blowing in from the harbor because things were different on Cambridge Street back then, and so it was, especially in the winter, a very tough walk. But it's we use it as a metaphor because the humiliation, and Benjamin Roberts had to do a similar walk when he was a child, which was very interesting that we found in one of his writings. The humiliation of walking past the 5 white schools. That's Sarah's long walk.
All the way to the Supreme Court. Yeah.
Is the Smith School where the former Peter Faneuil School is that where it
No, the Smith School is now the Museum of African American History.
Oh, okay. And 5 white schools that they had to walk by, or do you know where they were?
Well, we never actually sort of mapped it out, but it was part of the legal document.
Phillips, Otis, yeah.
We don't actually list them in the book.
But
Part of the legal
a
document.
few of them are still. The Phillips School is still there, and but in Morris's original document, he had kind of traced her walk, and that was really important to him.
Any questions? Yes.
Well, it's just a comment. Jonathan Cozell, Director of Education,
Yeah.
came to my son's school, which is Martin Luther King Open School in Cambridge, last year, and he talked about it was the first time he visited a school named after either King or Thurgood Marshall that was integrated. That the great irony is that all the schools named after Marshall and King were all predominantly black, and that the re-segregation of the schools was shocking.
Yeah. What we cover in the last 4 pages of the book actually is a searing indictment in his new book, and well worth your reading and attention. Thank you very much. Yes?
Can you say that once again, the new book?
Jonathan Cozell's new book.
The new book, Shame of the Nation, by Jonathan Cozell, and so many of his books, his earlier ones about Boston, and they're all very inspirational. But for the last, yeah, we also drew a lot in the last few pages from Gary Orfield's research at Harvard on the Harvard project on resegregation, I believe it's called. I mean, the numbers speak for themselves. You know, at this point in America, we're pretty much at the statistics we were at the time of Brown. I mean, it's really, really bad. And we write this, you know, for the activists out there who want to do something about this and want to put some new solutions on the table.
Yes.
It's sort of ironic, I want to comment on how laws can be turned on their heads from when one time they seem like it's the right thing, and then other times it's the same law, the wrong thing. And you talk about this young lady, young girl who had to walk beyond 5 white schools. Today, white and black children are often prevented from going to schools in their own neighborhood by those very same laws that you say should.
It's a grand irony.
How do you deal with these kind of interesting? Because I think that the laws themselves are not the ways to really resolve this. People vote their feet off it, and we've seen that in Boston.
Right.
Voted their feet. The laws are thousands of left. So.
Yeah.
I wonder if you could comment on that, because the irony of these laws are not all...
No, there's a great paradox in the book that Benjamin Roberts was making a heartfelt plea for neighborhood schools. And obviously, I was doing a talk out in the suburbs about a week ago, and one of the things that we're very clear about in the book is that the educational system cannot bear the full burden of racism in America. That's unrealistic. And we've been led down, I think, some interesting and torturous paths because we keep assuming somehow that the American schools can rectify what is in fact deeply encoded in human hearts and in property laws and in zoning and in all those attributes of economic class structure. But that's another book, and but you're quite right to note that there is a rich irony inside the book, and we were well aware of it. Yes.
Doesn't the author pronounce it Jonathan Cozell?
Did I pronounce it wrong? I'm sorry.
Thank you. Yeah.
Sorry about that.
I'm very intrigued by the idea of the know-nothing party being dominant in the legislature at the time that desegregation.
Yeah.
Can you explain how that happened, and knowing what it's like to work with the legislature now?
They still don't know.
She asked about, isn't that interesting that this great reform happened with the Know Nothing Party when we mostly know them as a very nativist and intolerant party. That's a very interesting kind of episode in the book because it happened overnight in the election of 1854. Before then there were no know-nothings in political power, but they had been meeting in lodges all over the state, and it was kind of using the Masonic model for a political party. It was like a secret society. And so all of a sudden, the election happens, And almost every the majority of statewide offices are won by this party. And if you weren't a part of it, you may never even heard of the Know-Nothings. And all of a sudden, the legislature, from the governor, is controlled by a party. It's very unique in American history. There's there are very few moments like that. But for something like that to happen, it had to have been a coalition of a lot of different people. So there were a lot of nativists in this party and people that were drawn to it because of their hatred of the Irish immigrants coming in. But there were other people, like this fellow Charles Slack, who kind of realized, I better get on this moving train. And he didn't necessarily share all their ideologies, but he identified that this party was about to do some big things. And that's why they fall apart so quickly after 1854, because it was a huge coalition, and that couldn't quite remain together. But so Charles Slack becomes, a know-nothing, and he was just really William Nell, who's a huge character in our book. And I always feel sorry we don't usually get to talk about him when we're doing talks, but he's a big character in the book, and he was a big part of this movement for equal schools. He kind of developed a relationship with Slack and lobbied him. Slack said in his speech on the ceremony when celebrating the integration that every time he'd see Nell, he would kind of hide because Nell just kept coming to the State House with all these petitions. They really stayed after these folks. But Slack was able to convince some of these colleagues that this was, a reform that was worth doing. And, I guess a lot of their intolerance was directed at the Irish at that point. And so the African Americans in the community kind of got a break. The Culture Factory, the history of the Boston schools, is actually I don't like that book that much, but it does talk a lot about this episode and how it relates to kind of the struggles between these different communities at the time. But that's kind of how the Know-Nothings factor into our story.
Thank you. And one more, and I guess we better close up. Yeah. Why don't you talk about Patrick Collins again?
You do hear a lot about the animosity and antagonism between black and Irish communities, which really goes, it starts in kind of the mid-19th century and you could argue maybe it goes till today. You hear a lot about this and how at this point in the mid-19th century it was rooted in the economic competition between them. But in the book, we wanted to tell some other stories that show that wasn't necessarily the entire picture. Like I said, Robert Morris was trained for the law by a white man named Ellis Gray Loring. And so decades on, Robert Morris is now a distinguished lawyer in Boston. And the Irish were being persecuted horribly, and just as African Americans were. And there was a young boy named Patrick Collins who Robert Morris had converted to Catholicism, and he worshipped with this young boy. And just like how Loring had noticed Morris's intelligence, he notices this young boy's intelligence and says, well, I'll train you for the law. Patrick Collins goes on to be one of the great mayors of Boston, and his statue sits on Commonwealth Avenue. And I just think that's such an amazing story that then he kind of went into another community and identified someone and mentored him. And Morris was known as one of the lawyers who the Irish community turned to. And he had, like I said, he converted to Catholicism. He had very deep ties to the Irish community of Boston. So while it's certainly true there was a lot of antagonism between these groups, there's other stories to be told. And there were bridges, and there continues to be bridges across different communities in Boston. And
one of the things we were happiest about in terms of writing this book, in the end, was in telling that story, yes, there is a statue of Patrick Collins on Commonwealth Avenue. There is no statue to William Nell, no statue to the Roberts family, no statue to Robert Morris. They have been largely lost in our self-understanding as a city, and I would submit as a nation. And what we try to do in Sarah's Long Walk is to give these people their due, and maybe a bit more, to bring them back out of obscurity into the light, where we think that they deserve to be, because they are genuine American heroes. So we thank you all very, very much.